The first event for YIISA of the 2008 to 2009 academic year. I'd like to welcome everyone on behalf of YIISA and on behalf of myself and also Charles Small. I'm Lauren Clark, the coordinator for YIISA, and I am going to apologize for Charles, who cannot be here this evening. He is actually attending a conference in Washington, D.C. On the state-sanctioned incitement to genocide, which YIISA is co-sponsoring with the International Association of Genocide Scholars. So the conference will address Iranian President Ahmadinejad's visit to the UN General Assembly in New York yesterday, and also specifically his repeated calls for wiping Israel off the map. So he sends his apologies and hopes to see all of you soon at our other events. So at this time, I'd like to welcome Mr. Mark Weitzman. Mark Weitzman is the director of the Task Force Against Hate and Terrorism at the Simon Wiesenthal Center. He is also the associate director of education there. He is a chief representative of the Center of the United Nations in New York, and he's currently a member of the advisory board for ISGAP, the Institute for Social and Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. He's a member of the U.S. delegation to the Task Force for International Cooperation on Holocaust Education, Remembrance, and Research. He's a board member and former vice president of the Association of Holocaust Organizations, also on the advisory panel of experts on freedom of religion or belief of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, also known as the OSCE. And he's also a member of the Jewish Catholic Dialogue Group of New York. Previously, Mr. Weitzman was the founding director of the Simon Wiesenthal Center's New York Tolerance Center. He is a prominent lecturer, speaker, and panelist for multiple conferences and groups, including Congress, the UN, the European Union, U.S. Army, and the FBI. In April of 2008, he was one of the Jewish leaders invited to meet with Pope Benedict XVI during his visit to the U.S., and was also selected by the Pew Charitable Trust as one of the 25 participants in a conference on international religious freedom. He has an extensive list of publications, including being the co-editor and also contributing to the memorial volume in honor of Simon Wiesenthal entitled Anti-Semitism, the Generic Hatred, Essays in Memory of Simon Wiesenthal, which was published in 2007 and also received the 2007 National Jewish Book Award for the Best Anthology. A forthcoming publication by Mr. Weitzman will be coming out this fall and published by the Vidal Sassoon Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and it is a monograph entitled Globalization, Conspiracy Theory, and the Shoah. So we'd now like to invite Mr. Weitzman up, and if you could help me welcome him.
Thank you very much for that welcome, and thank you for everyone for coming out tonight. I want to sort of begin against all rules of all speakers, where you're told never to apologize for anything when you start with. But I actually do want to apologize a little bit, because I realized as we were getting into it that the topic, the theme, the title of the presentation tonight was just extraordinarily broad. And there's no way that I, or I think almost anybody else, could really cover what that implies in that title. And I'm going to kind of narrow it down a little bit. So instead of this whole, broad anti-Semitism, there's so many different, I think, varieties of anti-Semitism today that I'm really going to focus on one or two specific areas and try to kind of wrap that up and spend a little time with them. So if I had to pick a title, I would actually change it a little bit to something called The Magical Logic. And I'm working off a quote by the historian Saul Friedlander, who wrote, "The magical logic of the marriage of the opposites, the coincidence of themes from the radical right and radical left, that is the most fundamental feature of fascism." And in some ways, the new discourse that I want to talk about and explore a little bit are that merging of themes, the borrowing from extreme right into left and so on, that go into and often play off of globalization and some of the other issues that are coursing through the world today, and sort of look at it in a very specific manner. If we think about it, when I mentioned before about anti-Semitism being, so many varieties of anti-Semitism, it used to be before the Shoah, before the Holocaust, we really sort of only talked about three different varieties. There was religious anti-Semitism, the classical anti-Semitism that had grown up in the religious tradition of Christianity and so on, and I'm not going to get into that. And I know my friend Charles here has also been interested in that topic for a long time. But basically, the results of the Holocaust led into Vatican II, the actions of the mainstream churches, which essentially repudiated all forms of theological anti-Semitism. That's not to say that strains don't exist today. It's not to say that there are not issues today. It's not to say that there are certainly major controversy, and I'll get to some of them right now. But in essence, the theological anti-Semitism that had existed and had in many ways contributed, not the only factor, but contributed to the Holocaust, was delegitimized. And of course, the same thing goes with what used to be called racial science. That as well was delegitimized. Eugenics and so on. Except for certain scientists still operating today, but on the core, on the edge of, on fringes of mainstream science, that is no longer acceptable either. So what was left was really one form of anti-Semitism that still has managed to maintain its viral capability. And that was sort of the conspiratorial or political form of anti-Semitism, and it obviously blossomed further into anti-Zionism. And of course, again, there are elements within all that I mentioned earlier of both religions as well as issues about science and health, in which that form of anti-Semitism still exists today. But nonetheless, it is really in its purest form the strongest, most overt sense of anti-Semitism. In other words, even people and institutions that claim that they're not anti-Semitic often will allow extreme manifestations of anti-Zionism to come out. And obviously the birth of the State of Israel was a further factor that enabled that to flourish. And so basically that kind of anti-Semitism has really, really jumped out at us. And in recent years has become even stronger. There was also another factor in that. The anti-Semitism of the conspiracy theorists, and the classic text, of course, is the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, was based on the idea that a small core of Jews, a cabal, if you will, with its connotations of Kabbalah, of esoteric mysticism and so on, and secret Jewish plotting, was located in the fringes of society, or in the shadows of society, pulling strings and manipulating. But with the creation of the State of Israel, Jews were no longer in the closet, so to speak. They had come out as full-fledged actors onto the stage of history, of international politics. And that meant for the anti-Semites, it was a step further that was harder for them to take. And maybe a classic manifestation of this was the last political will of Adolf Hitler. He wrote, "Centuries will pass away, but the hatred against those finally responsible, international Jewry and its helpers will grow. I have also made it quite plain that if the nations of Europe are again to be regarded as mere shares to be bought and sold by the international conspirators of money and finance, then that race Jewry, which is real criminal to murderous struggle, will be saddled with responsibility." So today, the anti-Semitism, which was always a constant, especially on the radical right, was commanded by one of its iconic figures to avenge itself against the perceived Jewish victory at the end of World War II. And following immediately on that, 3 years after that Jewish victory, was the emergence of the Jew into the world stage as a full-fledged actor. And this meant that the imperative to act was perhaps even stronger than it had ever been before. So what we have essentially is a pattern that the historian Robert Chazen once described as, he wrote that every new stage in the evolution of anti-Jewish thinking is marked by a dialectical interplay between a prior legacy of negative stereotypes and the realities of a new social context. Meaning that the stereotypes have always existed in certain levels, but they're brought into new shape and given new form by the context of the times in which they appear. So what I want to do here is explore some of that context a little bit more. Now, and I'm going to do it by basically looking at some of the figures and some of the themes that come out, have been used recently in the extremist right wing, if you want to call it neo-Nazi, whatever you want to call it, and I'm not going to get into strict definitions of all those terms, but to explore those a little bit and then show how they began to permeate out of their narrow context into a wider context and some of the influences that they may have. So for example, in the United States right now, they're going through a period of flux in the extreme right wing. Former charismatic and leadership figures like William Pierce of the National Alliance, Richard Butler of the Aryan Nations, Matt Hale of the World Church of the Creator have all left the scene. Pierce and Butler died. Hale was in prison. Each of those three, and I'll pick those three specifically, were noteworthy. One is because they had reached a certain level of notoriety or prominence in the movement. Two is because they were each trained beyond what we sometimes think and look as a stereotype of an extreme right-winger. And sometimes many people still have the idea that these are people who, are obviously failures in the world and are embittered because they're reduced to pumping gas and can't compete in the world today. Or they're on unemployment or whatever. We look at them as total failures. But each of those three that I mentioned were not failures in the classic sense. Pierce had a PhD in physics from Rice and taught at Oregon State before he devoted his time, starting in the mid-1960s, being a full-time neo-Nazi. Butler was an aeronautical engineer for Lockheed and held certain patents, including one for the tires, I think, that are still used on airplanes. And Hale, who was much younger, in his 30s, and finally sentenced to life imprisonment for trying to kill a federal judge, was a law school graduate and a classical musician who played in an orchestra he lived in Peoria, but in that area. So each of those three had the ability to succeed and turn that ability not to conventional success, but to organizing and to their work in the neo-Nazi movement. But they're all gone now. They're off the scene. What's left are really second-raters, and that's being kind. But each of them has made their mark. The person who fills that gap the most today is a person that you've probably heard of, named David Duke. Not going into Duke's whole background and his whole history, but Duke now has a group called EURO, which is the European American Unity and Rights Organization, and has recently tried to reinvent himself as a thinker, as a leader. He received a PhD from a Ukrainian university, a private university, a few years ago for a dissertation that was an anti-Semitic tract. This university has been denounced by the Ukrainian president, the Ukrainian Academy of Arts and Sciences, but is essentially specialized in anti-Semitism. It's a management school, and Duke's now a part-time faculty member there. But after he got out of prison, another story, he was in there for basically defrauding his followers and so on, and tax issues. In 2004, he called together members of this movement to New Orleans, and he created something called the New Orleans Protocol, which basically was a document meant to end infighting among the groups, the figures in this movement, and to establish sort of ground rules to get along with. And of course, by calling them together, bringing them together, and being the first one to sign the document, he was not only reasserting his presence in the movement, but his prime role, his leadership role in a sense, of bringing the person to get everybody together. But during that meeting, Duke, of course, singled out Jews as signs of the world problems. And what he said, and specifically about Jews, was the worldwide Jewish conspiracy to destroy the white race through immigration and miscegenation, race mixing. The fear of race mixing is one of the prime fears that motivate these people. What's interesting about it is that it's not just considered on racial terms, but it's considered part and parcel of the Jewish plot. If you have time, I was going to show you some internet websites, but I'm just going to describe a game that's present on the internet now called Border Patrol. This is a game that, very simple. It shows immigrants crossing a river, and obviously they're Hispanic, Latino immigrants. The river Cactus, obviously meant to refer to the Rio Grande in Texas. And the idea is that these are illegal immigrants crossing the border from Mexico into the United States. The object of the game is quite simple. You shoot as many as you can. The more you shoot, kill, the higher your score. And in the corner is a small American flag. But in the corner of the American flag, where the stars are, instead of the stars that you usually see in the American flag, is one star, the Star of David. Meant to show, and this game operates on many levels, meant to show that while the U.S. is being weakened by these illegal immigrants, the person or the group letting them in, causing the United States to let them in, pulling the strings once again in control of the U.S. government, are the Jews. And the acronym very often used by these people is ZOG, Zionist Occupied Government, referring to the United States government. Or the variant, JOG, Jewish Occupied Government. Which is one of the ways that, by the way, that they can also claim that U.S. laws don't apply to them, and the U.S. government rules don't apply to them because the government's been occupied, taken over. It's not a true American government anymore. So this whole thing operates on different levels. Now that game is sinister enough on a certain level. What I observed last winter was that the game had been around for a couple of years, about 3-4 years. And then I noticed last year on the internet, I found mention of it not no longer on the extremist websites, but I found mention of it in mainstream gaming sites, where there were discussions of it and its qualities and so on. Not its theme, but just its qualities. And I saw this kind of leaching of the extremist fringe, in certain cases, into the mainstream, which is exactly what they desire and what they want. The whole internet thing is worth a whole other presentation. I don't know if we'll have time for it. If we do, I can show you a lot on it, but we'll see if we can get to it today. Duke refers to his own awakening to the Jewish issue. He calls it Jewish supremacism, and as the root of all major issues, including 9/11, of course, was caused by Israelis. I don't have to go into all of it, but just some samples and quotes about it. And one of the things that was also the root of all this is globalization. And what we find is globalization, and this is where we start getting into it, a theme that is very often associated with the left, anti-globalization, is actually a theme that is grabbed onto by the extreme right. So Duke writes, "For the last few decades of my life, I've earnestly tried to inform people that those who are the true forces behind globalism are in actuality racial supremacists. But no, they are not the so-called racial supremacists the media talks about. They are not European, African, or Asian supremacists. They are Jewish supremacists." And then he refers, of course, to the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. We're going to come back to the whole thing about globalization, and actually, you know, we'll do it here and then just work it in terms of time. When you think about it, logic about it, there is a certain logic. How the extreme right is so anti-globalization. First of all, in many cases, the themes of classical National Socialism were the farmer, the earth, Nazi Germany, the land, nothing with big business. Furthermore, the separation, borders, culture, folk, and so on. Anything that smacked of breaking down these kind of barriers would be anathema. And then there's also another shorthand as well. And I'm sort of pushing a lot together here, compressing a lot there. The shorthand is very simple. Who's in favor of globalization? Big business. Multinational corporations. Who controls multinational corporations? Wall Street. And if I was doing a diagram, I would just put equals, equals, equals in between, because the next step is Wall Street equals Jews. So globalization very quickly, in a very brief shorthand, becomes another synonym for Jewish control and domination via the protocols or an updated version. And Pierce once wrote something called the New Protocols, dealing with these issues. So this explains very simply how they can be in that vote. But it's not only globalization. It's also things as odd as ecology. There's a green-brown movement, in a way. And here again, Duke is our guide into it. He wrote, "I do, though, have an abiding love for our white race and the civilization and root values that it created. I want my children and all my descendants to live in a free and healthy society, not a third world hovel. I want to preserve the unique character and beauty of my people the same way that as an ecology-minded individual, I desire the preservation of the blue whale or the great African elephant." So out of the kindness of his heart and his feelings toward nature, he wants to support the white race and keep it great by keeping it pure from any contact or mixture with lower races. And again, there was evidence of this going back to Nazi Germany, without going into tracing the whole history behind it. And Duke is not the only one who has written about these things. Even though I've used them to sort of sketch out the parameters, this is not new. Pierce, already back in 1976, wrote that there are in fact several issues in which we are closer to what would ordinarily be considered the left-wing or liberal position than we are to the conservative or right-wing position, which flies against every common belief that we would have about neo-Nazis. We would almost automatically assume, if we had to lump them in a political spectrum, that they're closer to a conservative position. And yet Pierce himself, over 30 years ago, was writing that this isn't true. One of these issues is the ecology issue, the protection of our natural environment, the elimination of pollution and the protection of wildlife. And there are also other issues in which are closer to the liberals than to the conservatives, although I doubt that we completely agree with them on every issue, just as we seldom, if ever, completely agree with the right wing on any issue. And Pierce also, of course, was anti-globalization. Every few months for the past year, I've used this program to warn against the policy of economic globalization. He said that in 1998. He's not the only one. That's been a glimpse at the United States, and those are probably the two of the most prominent figures in the movement in the United States. But there's another figure, there are other figures around the world, and just to give you some of them in the sense to get a sense of the globalization of this issue. Horst Mahler is a prominent German extremist. Mahler has had a fascinating career because he embodied some of this in his own life. He began as a lawyer defending Andreas Baader, or the Baader-Meinhof gang, which was the extreme left terrorist gang in West Germany in the 1970s. And Mahler befriended him, defended him, was his lawyer, and then was actually jailed for participating in a violent shootout in a rescue attempt to free Baader. While he was in prison, at a certain point, he had an epiphany. And he went from the extreme left to the extreme right. And again, by the way, there are roots of this. Again, I don't know how many people go back and have studied National Socialism and all that, but if you remember the conflict between Hitler and the Strasser brothers, it was based on part of this, in a blunt way, the emphasis of whether the socialism part should be emphasized or the national part should be emphasized. So there are parallels to this in the past. Anyway, Mahler joined the NPD, which is the German neo-Nazi political party, so to speak, became one of its leading ideologues, and subsequently left them to form something called Deutsches College or Deutsche Academy, which is sort of a think tank on the extreme right, but has also been prominent in this whole vein. Writing after 9/11, 10 days after 9/11, he wrote that globalism, already powerfully damaged by the runaway world economic crisis, will sink down upon itself like the towers of Manhattan under 1,000 dagger strikes from Islamic fundamentalism. Now, and he keeps writing in March 2001, he writes that links Jews to globalization. We have to find this prospect unpleasant, especially since the power hides behind the smokescreen of fine-sounding words like enlightenment, tolerance, emancipation, modernism, human rights, free trade, and globalism. And in the present world situation, globalism needs to be linked to the objective existence of the Jewish question. And he further went on by saying in an interview posted on the internet that what is generally meant by democracy is actually Jewish rule, which Jewish plutocrats exercise through their control of global finance, monetary system, and the media. I do know that the nations are going to liberate themselves from the Jewish yoke. And Mahler has continued in that vein. He's been writing further about these things. But what is interesting about Mahler is that he's also begun to reach out to radical Islam. And we're going to see that trend as well developing in terms of how the extremes, the circles come together. Mahler mentioned earlier, in one of the quotes I read earlier, he spoke positively about the role of Islamic fundamentalism in bringing down globalization. And as a matter of fact, beyond that, just recently, this past spring, the NPD in Germany, following up on Mahler's words, and again, they've gone without going through all the permutations of what role Mahler's playing now exactly and so on. But the Deutsche Academy came out with, called its comrades to participate in anti-Israel demonstrations of the peace movement, left-wing anti-imperialism, Arab associations, and Turkish extremist groups. They recommended that they put down their opposition to the Antifa, which are the European anti-fascist left and extreme left groups, as well as the multi-cult, which is their term for multiculturalists. In other words, they're saying, put aside all your enmity to those who are normally your enemies. Put it aside for the common good. And what's the common good? Against Israel, against Jews, against the US. And give priority to a common anti-imperialist concern for Islamism was not our enemy, in their own words. So it was recommended that they renounce the provocations typical of their scene, which includes waving the swastikas and waving the black, white, red flag and so on and so forth. In other words, sublimate everything that you've always done and stood for to fit in to the scene, all the better. So you can participate, swell the numbers for a common goal. And the classic explanation of that, of course, is the enemy of my enemy, and so on. This is nothing, no, I shouldn't say nothing new, but it's been going on for a while. Duke, who I mentioned obviously earlier, had gone around to quite a number of the Gulf states. Syria, been interviewed there, been on media there. As a matter of fact, he claims to have given Ahmadinejad the idea for the Holocaust Denial Conference that he held in Tehran in 2006. According to Duke, he whispered this in Ahmadinejad's ear when they had a meeting, and Ahmadinejad took it from there. I haven't seen Ahmadinejad's response to that, but it just gives you a sense of what's going on. There's a whole group of right-wing extremists internationally who have made links with Islamic radicals and extremists. A man named Ahmed Huber, who was a Swiss financier, and again, I'm not going into too much detail on him. His connection, he actually converted to Islam. His connections are so deep that in 2002 he was put on the watch list. The watch list is the US immigration list of people who are not allowed to enter the country. For example, Kurt Waldheim, after his Nazi past was exposed, was put on the watch list. On one of the lists put out in the wake of 2001, Huber, because he was a financier involved with financing some groups that were linked to terrorism, was actually, I think, number 56 on a list of 62. That was in November 2001. He was put on that list and barred from entering the United States. He gave interviews as far back as 1965 where he talked about his admiration for Hitler, and he kept a bust of Hitler on his desk when he was interviewed. And yet, converted to Islam, has worked with Islamist groups, has found refuge in Iran at times, and his links are very strong on both sides of that coin. Before I forget, in Germany, 2006, the paper, the journal of the NPD, Deutsche Stimme, gave an interview with the head of they gave an explanation of Islam that meant to whitewash Islamic radicalism and present it to its readers in a better light. So we're seeing different ways that it's playing out, not just in terms of the elites such as Huber or Mahler or people like that, but even going to the mass, to the appeals to the people on the streets and to the readership of the journal. David Maia is another figure from the UK. Maia was a longtime neo-Nazi, very prominent, who was involved, as a matter of fact, was Combat 18, which was the group that there was a bomber named David Copeland who blew up a gay bar and a couple of other places in London a number of years ago, serving a life sentence. Maia was the theoretician of Combat 18. 18 is one of the neo-Nazi acronyms of numbers, standing for the first letter of the alphabet and the 8th letter of the alphabet. In other words, it's a neo-Nazi version of what in Hebrew we call gematria, numerology in a sense. And the A, the first letter, stands for Adolf, and the 8th letter is H, Hitler. So Combat 18 is an action arm of neo-Nazis. Maia converted to Islam a few years ago in the same mosque, Brixton Mosque, that Richard Reed, the shoe bomber, and others participated in, whose imam was deported from the UK a number of years ago. And Maia has made it a point of writing over recent years. Not only has he visited and spent time in the Middle East, but he's made a point of literally writing about how he wants to bring neo-Nazis and Islamic extremists together. And if you go, for example, to the website of the Aryan Nations or groups like that, which are sort of falling apart and stuff, but you'll see evidence of this because Maia's writings are in there. For a while, the Aryan Nations, in one of their splinter existences after Butler's death, had a minister of, I forget what they called it, to the Muslim world, or the Arab, which meant nothing practically, but it just showed what they were going, the direction they were trying to link up in. Now, whether Maia was really a neo-Nazi, was really a sincere convert to Islam or so on, I'm not sure the answer to that. He's also, after Islam, he sort of veered into kind of a paganism, a neo-pagan outlook. These are not necessarily the most stable people in the world. And the truth is, the links, in some ways, are not that strong between neo-Nazis and Islamic extremists, because the bottom line is, for a jihadist, these are still white Europeans, Christian, pagan, but certainly not Muslim. So there's a certain level of suspicion and distance that they haven't bridged yet, except for one area. And that's the area of Holocaust denial. There you actually have convergences. Part of it may be because that's the more intellectual arm of both groups at a certain level. A number of figures from the Muslim world or from the Arab world who are into Holocaust denial are more secular or even Christian Arabs. So there is room to build bridges there, but bridges have been built for a long time. Very quickly, to go into it, I have a whole list of contexts that I go into, especially between Iran and so on. I'll get to some of those immediately. But it's one of the first tangible evidences of this was not the conference that was held in Tehran in 2006, but there's actually an attempt going back to 2001, spring of 2001, by a man named Jürgen Graf, who fled Switzerland because he was about to be jailed for violating hate crimes laws, fled to Iran, got Iranian money to fund the conference in Beirut that was being co-sponsored by the Institute for Historical Review, which is the US Center of Holocaust Denial, based out in California. And this conference was meant to bring together leading figures, Pierce, Mahler, they were all committed to coming from the US, along with leading figures from the Muslim world. It collapsed under a barrage of criticism, to the point where, controversially, because we were never 100% sure, Edward Said came out against it, but then he later seemed to backtrack. They came out against it. It was sort of never 100% clear, but he certainly did not endorse it wholeheartedly. And eventually this, as I said, it collapsed. And a follow-up was eventually held in Jordan about a year later, just on a much more minor key. Mahler and Pierce did not make it. Some of their speeches were read. The Arab figures were not as prominent. But it showed something. The IHR, Institute of Historical Review, in its own conferences, starting about 2001, 2002, and they haven't had many conferences recently, had people presenting on topics related to the Middle East from the Palestinian, Arab, Muslim perspective. David Irving, perhaps the world's most notorious Holocaust denier, has also linked up and had people connections with people in these circles. And if we get to Iran, going back to 1987, 20 years ago, there was a series of neo-Nazi and Holocaust denial books put out in France. The French police actually wanted to question and suspected an official at the Iranian embassy who wrote a check underwriting these publications. Iranian President Rafsanjani in 1998 said that the murder of the Jews by the Nazis was only a propaganda act by the Zionists. In other words, before Ahmadinejad, a decade before Ahmadinejad, roughly, Iranian's president was already denying the Holocaust. His successor, Ali Khamenei, 2001, Zionist exaggerated statistics, and so on. 1990, a Moroccan named Ahmed Rami, who, again, fled Morocco because he tried to join a revolt against the king there, fled to Sweden, served time in prison for violating hate crime laws in Sweden, runs a virulent radio station website called Radio Islam, which, very straightforward, has nothing to do with normative Islam. It exists only for one purpose, and it's anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial. But Rami visited Iran upon his release and was honored by a special session of the Iranian parliament. A Frenchman, Raja Gharadi, who converted to Islam. His case, convicted in France, again, of violating Holocaust denial, hate crime speech, his case was taken at the highest levels of the Iranian government, and they actually paid for some of the fine that was given him, and they actually protested to the French embassy. Graf, I mentioned, an Austrian, an Australian, all found their way to Iran over the past 5-6 years. And a number of these spoke at the Denial Conference in 2006. The recent conference in Tehran in 2006 brought together a number of familiar names. David Duke was there. The Frenchman Robert Fursan has written that the Diary of Anne Frank was a hoax. Frederick Tobin, Australia's most prominent Holocaust denier from the Adelaide Institute. Bradley Smith, who was the person in the United States who a number of years ago tried to put those ads in campus newspapers claiming that the Holocaust never happened. Michael Piper, who is a longtime employee of a man named Willis Cardo. Cardo Funds, where actually was a founder of the Institute for Historical Review, funded the Liberty Lobby, Spotlight Magazine, is one of the leading underwriters of extremist right stuff in the United States for the past 40 years or so. He was there representing Cardo. Jürgen Graf, the Swede who I mentioned, was the Swiss man who was given the money to organize the Beirut conference. They all came down to Tehran. They were all welcomed with open arms. So this is nothing new, this linkage and this mixture. The interesting thing, by the way, I'll point out while we're talking about Tehran is I don't know if any of you saw the pictures and looked at that conference, but the anomaly there, of course, was the presence of the Neturei Karta, the extreme Orthodox, sort of ultra-Hasidic group that showed up there. It's interesting for a number of levels. First of all, it's not their first contact with Iran. They've been working with them over the years. They had a visit in 2000 as well. They're actually approved visitors and the link of the tiny Iranian Jewish community, which still exists, to the outside world in a sense. And they're an approved link because obviously they're anti-Zionist, and obviously they're willing to sit down with anybody, including neo-Nazis and so on. But I took a look at what they actually said there. And it was actually very interesting, because what they actually said there was not Holocaust denial. They were the only people who stood up. And they literally said, one of their spokespeople, one of the rabbis stood up there and said, anyone who denied the Holocaust is an idiot. My grandparents died there. They blamed the Zionists for using it as a political tool. They gave a blessing to Ahmadinejad. But they actually stood up and claimed that the Holocaust was real. So it's a very bizarre case, and that's worth a whole nother long conversation about. In their own lights, they're not only trying to rescue Jews in a theological sense, but actually to rescue the world and keep the world running on the axis that they believe God put it on, that Zionism has ruptured. But again, that's a whole nother conversation. So why are the Iranians, for example, I was wondering why they were so involved in Holocaust denial. What is worth it? Why does the president of Iran, dealing with an issue that in a certain sense is so, there's no gain in it necessarily, and what is the whole point of this? And there are a couple things. One is that the Iranians are watching something that's happening in the Western world, and that is, there's a growing trend toward the institutionalization of the Holocaust. Meaning that if you look, for example, at the United Nations, in light of Durban, and we can discuss all the political reasons and whether the motives are pure or impure or whatever, but the United Nations has taken certain steps. Over the past couple of years, there's been a resolution at the General Assembly that was passed that declared January 27th an official day of commemoration for victims of the Holocaust, which meant that the United Nations was acknowledging, and all member states were acknowledging not only that the Holocaust happened, but the wording of the resolution went right back to the origins of the United Nations being rooted in revulsion, the world's revulsion of the events of the Holocaust. They also passed a motion the next year, a resolution decrying Holocaust denial, which, although it did not mention Iran or Ahmadinejad, was obviously aimed directly at the Iranians. But it's not only the paper. They created, for example, an office of Holocaust outreach, which has been producing conferences and material and distributing material to the UN information offices around the world. And in other words, it's active. Furthermore, the groups that were mentioned earlier that I do some work with, International Task Force on Holocaust Education, Research and Remembrance, 25 countries that came out of a Swedish, US, a couple of other countries initiative around 2000 that now basically underwrite and support and require Holocaust education in all the member states. But putting it in a nutshell, that's very vague. What that means is that the countries that began it were Western countries such as UK, Israel, the United States, etc., 5 countries, Germany, and they basically came together and looked at the countries emerging from beyond the Iron Curtain, the countries where the Holocaust took place. Poland, Croatia, Slovakia, etc. And said that those countries have not been exposed to history, have not been exposed to the last 50 years of education about the Holocaust, and they will need help. And this was meant to give them a hand. But it requires a formal commitment. The request to join has to be signed by basically either the foreign minister or an equivalent member of government, meaning it's a formal governmental request. To join it, the country that's seeking to join has to commit to 4 things. First is a national day of commemoration for the victims of the Holocaust in its own country. Meaning, in other words, they institutionalize Holocaust remembrance in their country. It does not have to be the 27th of January. It could be a local date that's more appropriate. They commit to free and open access to all World War II era archives, which is a little problematic because some members have not really opened up all their archives yet. But nonetheless, it is now something that you can go back to them and say, you're required to do this. And they commit to supporting Holocaust education about the Holocaust in their country, which means revising, rewriting, or writing textbooks. It means going back to sites of camps and so on, and creating memorials and exhibitions and text. It means pedagogical training, having people from the US, Yad Vashem, and Israel, or so on, go into the country and work with teachers there, or bring them over here, or to Israel, or to Germany, or to the Anne Frank House, and so on, and work with them. And there's a commitment, each member has to pay 30,000 euro, which is nothing, and that is put into a fund that then underwrites and gives grants to programs in that country. So that's one level. The OSCE, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which again grew out of the Helsinki process in the 1970s, dealing with both security and human rights issues. In the wake of Durban, took up through a series of high-level conferences in Berlin and Vienna and Cordoba, and became a mechanism for fighting anti-Semitism. There are 56 countries in the OSCE, 25 or so in the ITF, the task force, and another 5 waiting to join the task force. These countries in the OSCE, not only have they produced a declaration about anti-Semitism and so on, but there are now teaching materials about anti-Semitism, about Holocaust, that have been developed specifically for their use, that are distributed basically in all OSCE member states, from the UK to Kazakhstan and so on. Now, it doesn't mean they're being used all the time, but it means that they're available and they've been quote-unquote sanctioned and done under the authority of the OSCE, and so it's an opportunity to get in on the grassroots and to do things in places that no one ever would have imagined 15 years ago that any of these things happen. So the Iranians, in a sense, have looked around at all this. And I'm not sure if they know 100% about the OSCE because they're not a part of that. But they certainly know about the UN stuff. And I think they've realized that the Holocaust has become, in a way, a form of institutionalized memory. And people sign on, countries sign on. And this is a threat to Iran. By delegitimizing the Holocaust, the Iranians, in essence, among other things, also can delegitimize the roots of the UN. If the UN was founded in terms of revulsion for the Holocaust, then taking away, that takes away the need or the power of some of the moral prestige of the UN, which makes its efforts against Iran even weaker or less legitimate. And it actually even goes further than that. It also delegitimizes a lot of human rights law and activities, and war crimes tribunals, and all those other elements that are inconvenient and nasty little reminders for an Iranian government, or at least individuals in the Iranian government, that might feel threatened by those. So I think that there is a political reason, policy reason, why they are spending so much time on the Holocaust. I think it also may have some unintended events, though, or some unintended repercussions as well. For one thing, there is no native school of Holocaust denial in the Muslim world. The same way that a lot of the tropes of anti-Semitism, of the protocols of the elders of Zion, of blood libel, things like that, ritual murder, penetrated from the West into the Islamic world. Same thing with Holocaust denial. But in doing so, it requires the tools of West thought, historiography, engineering, chemical analysis. All these are the tools that are abused by the Holocaust deniers, but they're tools that are in essence denigrated, usually, by the Iranians. This is one of the few times where they open up their society and allow these tools to be brought in. And we've actually seen, in certain cases, a response from some Iranians. There was a letter in the New York Review of Books signed by 100 Iranians in exile and in Iran at the time of the conference, repudiating the conference. There was a comment by the former foreign minister of Iran in the parliament saying, speaker in the parliament said, "Have we ever asked that questioning the Holocaust has harmed us and what we get out of it?" So it's entirely possible that the results on the grassroots level may be far different than what Ahmadinejad had wanted. I don't have an answer for that. That's pure speculation. But it's an interesting train of thought to follow. So I'm going to close now. I mean, we could continue a lot more on some of this stuff. I'm just see if there's anything else. Yeah, the only other thing, these things are still going on right now. Just about a month ago, August 18th, the head of the Institute for Historical Review, the Center for Holocaust Denial in the U.S., appeared in Baltimore at a conference sponsored by Muslim extremists, local Muslim extremists. And there he spoke, not about Holocaust denial. If you look at, I mean, and again, I've gone through your website over the years, and the percentage of Holocaust denial, there's a group that initially defined themselves just in terms of Holocaust denial. Now, you look at the news stories on there. Today I did it again. The 25 lead stories, news stories, only 2 dealt with World War II. Neither of them dealt with Holocaust denial. One was a YouTube link to Leni Riefenstahl's film of the 36 Olympics. And the other was a story out of Rome. The mayor of Rome kind of defended the fascist legacy. That was it. Everything else was current events, globalization, war, etc. They've had to broaden their appeal. The niche that they had occupied on the fringes of society was not getting them anyplace. But they had the models, based on the earlier efforts from the Nazis and so on, to be able to find terms of discourse, anti-globalization, anti-Zionism, ecology, that they could link up or penetrate into circles far beyond their initial limited appeal. And that's one of the things that they've been doing and they've been reaching out to. And with some success. Not a great deal, but some success. I could give you, again, more concrete examples. Professor at a university in Oregon who was a pacifist in World War II, retired, founded a Pacifica Forum, again, very, much on a somewhat liberal or left perspective, has been bringing in Holocaust deniers, has been bringing in neo-Nazis, and has been linking them to these themes as well. So we're seeing it going on, that this is the ongoing effort for these people, what they're trying to accomplish, whether they'll succeed or not. I don't know if their influence will ever become so dramatically direct, but tangentially, they can certainly have an impact. They can certainly shape discussion, shape thought, and essentially, it goes back to what I said earlier at the very beginning, that if we look at anti-Judaism, the history of anti-Judaism, it's this dialectical interplay between the stereotypes and the ideas in the past and the context in which we live in today. The context today is what we have to face. We need to understand it. We need to see the linkages between the past. Otherwise, we'll end up fighting basically a 21st century battle with 20th century weapons. And that's never a good recipe for success. So I hope that I've been able to give you a little bit of a window. It's a much more narrowly defined frame than that grandiose title that you came here perhaps thinking that you were going to get. But it is one that I think is important. I think it is sometimes neglected. And as I said, I hope that's given you a little bit better perspective and understanding. Thank you. And the proverbial question and answer time that's being moderated.
Yeah, I've got a question. First, I'm very grateful.
Do you want to say anything first?
Yeah. Okay.
Please, Simon.
Okay. I have a kind of similar experience coming from Europe. That means there is a kind of decline in Holocaust denial as known. On the other side, there is a huge amount of new literature, new propaganda material, both from Muslim side, from right-wing extremists, but also liberals and left-wing extremists, according to anti-Zionism, also ecology, of course, but also something like, for example, this new Holocaust museum in Gaza Strip, established by Hamas. That means now radicals of all time, but especially Palestinians, for example, they are playing the card of Holocaust. It means they are talking about Holocaust. Not of course Holocaust didn't happen. I think to us also Holocaust happens. Or you have this PETA, this organization for the treatment of animals. They are playing the same card for several years now. Holocaust on your table. That means killing animals because we need something to eat is the same as killing Jews in the Holocaust. So this is also not a offensive kind of Holocaust denial as we know, but it's a new form. And I think maybe this was the point you wanted to show us. And I think it's really, for the next couple of years or decades, a very important thing, what I was calling a universalization or trivialization of the Holocaust by playing the card of the Holocaust.
I think you're right. I mean, and I didn't give as many examples as we could. We just sat here and listed examples. The ones you mentioned are absolutely true. There is no question about, I think certain elements of the Palestinian movement have attempted to take the term Holocaust and the description, and they basically called for Similar things. In other words, just their claim is what applied to the Jews after the Holocaust in terms of assistance to DPs and so on, and resettlement and bringing them, all that should apply to their community. They've called, it was Mahmoud Darwish, the poet who recently died, I think in the 1990s or whatever, wrote an appeal that was based on a similar idea. And I don't remember the exact language, but it was almost sounded as if you would take a UJA kind of appeal and just transpose the names and stuff, and it had similar images in the similar language. PETA was also, they had a very controversial ad a number of years ago, where they basically paralleled the famous picture of survivors, of prisoners, inmates in a camp, with, I think, it was chickens in a coop. And it turned out that when they were criticized, because we criticized them among other groups, they threatened lawsuits. And, well, it turned out that they dropped everything because they had really gotten their photos kind of without permission. They were using the photos from the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. That whole thing ended up fizzling away. But again, it was this sense of using the Holocaust as a term, a frame of reference that everybody can understand, and channeling your cause into it, or using it for your own cause. And that leads into the effect of trivialization. There are forms of trivialization as well, and sometimes I think, those of us in the Jewish community can sometimes go in that sense also, calling every disaster or every misstep or something a Holocaust is not quite the same. I actually rejected the comparisons that were going strong a few years ago between the events of the 1930s and the events of 2002, 2003, and so on. To me, they just did not stand up historically, that comparison. A more appropriate comparison were the 1970s, where you had, again, similar to the range of terrorism, you had bombs in Europe, you had hijackings of planes, you had the UN resolution of equating Zionism and racism, and all that occurred in 1972, the Munich Olympics, to 1975 and 1976. So it was roughly the same time span and roughly the same kind of things. It was not analogous to me to take it back to 1937 or 35 or whatever. And I will say, by the way, I drew some strength in that, because following in the 1970s, there was a period of roughly 25 years that were relatively quiet and good in terms of Jewish life and anti-Semitism compared to the time before and the time after. So I looked at it and it said, we did survive that period in the 1970s, Kippur War and all that stuff. And we came out of it for almost a generation of relative peace. So that gives hope to me that we'll get through this period as well and come out of it. But it's a hard work. It's a hard job, not to minimize it.
I may be jumping the gun here in the time frame, but it would seem to me that conspiracy theorists would have a field day with the current financial problems, the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, subprime mortgages. Have you seen any sign yet that's going to blame this all on the Jews?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. First of all, it's already out there. By the way, I guess I could go into the whole question of neocons and, being all Jewish and so on and so forth. In other words, any current public event that does not work yet, well, I guess the best of all possible hopes, can then ultimately be blamed on the Jews, especially when it comes to finance, especially when it comes to money. I'm seeing parts of it starting already on some of the internet sites and some of the the conversations going on. It'll be institutionalized. In other words, it'll be written up, it'll be formalized, and there's no question that you'll be able to take your choice between extreme left, whatever extremist you want, will go in that direction. That's the one prophecy that I'll make here with absolute certainty.
That's a question.
Do you think the bailout will be looked at as from that same perspective, that the government is now helping the Jews, you know, the capitalists.
Yeah. I think it will, because I think that the bottom line for a lot of these people are that they believe that the entire financial system was set up to benefit a small number of people. And while not necessarily every one of those people were Jewish, but the majority were, or the ones that aren't were fronts for Jews. So the bailout is going to definitely be seen as signs that the government is taking care of those who are behind it. And especially in terms of, I'm sure it's going to come out about salaries of Wall Street executives, you know, so on and so forth. It's classic. I mean, it's just made to fill in the blanks. But there's absolutely no question in my mind that this whole thing is going to be turned around in that vein. And I would suspect that if I left here and went onto my computer, I could already find articles and so on in that vein. There's no question about it.
You talked about how the right wing is reaching out by making arguments that are traditionally considered leftist arguments, like the anti-globalization argument. What's the reception on the left to these efforts?
It's actually in some ways scary, because in some ways it's been accepted. You go to places, some of the World Social Forums, for example, where there are signs of this kind of thing having come into it, where you'll have people making comments that, you know, that Hitler was not that bad when it came to this topic. There are a number of pieces that have explored this perspective, and basically, well, let me put it this way, you just find some bizarre people there. I just got word of a conference, oh yeah, I'm sorry, the one in Baltimore that I just mentioned, that had the Institute for Historical Review's director, a longtime neo-Nazi named Mark Weber, sponsored by Muslim extremists. You know who one of the other speakers was? Ramsey Clark, the former Attorney General, very much on the left, who has also been appearing on this circuit over the past few years. And I tell you, I grew up admiring Ramsey Clark in many ways when I was younger for his work as Attorney General and so on. And yet he's been on this circuit, and here's a perfect example. He had the opportunity not to appear with these people, but he went ahead and did it. Kirkpatrick Sale, another figure on the left, has been involved with a group in Vermont that had been linked until recently with the White Citizens Councils in the South, which are basically a group of kind of neo-Confederate racists. And Sale has been involved with the Newberry Institute, I forget exactly which organization he's been involved with this guy named Thomas Naylor. And up until about a month ago, they refused any criticism. Naylor has finally come out and called and said that the citizens' councils have to drop the racist stuff and so on and so forth. But they had no problem until they were publicly exposed, until someone called them on it. And this had nothing to do directly with anti-Semitism. They had no problem linking up with it. And this is, I think, is problematic. Whether it's delusional, whether it's the enemy of my enemy, I'm not quite sure, you know, the psychology of it. But there are enough manifestations, enough people that falling into that it bears notice.
I had a question, actually.
Good.
Can you speak more about the link between contemporary anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial? I mean, I don't know if that's a clear enough question. But
No, it's very clear. I would do it. I think it's actually, I may run the risk of simplifying here, but I'll go ahead and run the risk. I don't think there's any basis for Holocaust denial other than anti-Semitism. I think they're absolutely wrapped up together. The people who are involved in Holocaust denial, the professionals, spend a lot of time studying the Holocaust. My guess is that they probably spent more time studying it than anyone outside of specialists in the field. And yet with all that, and despite all that, they claim it never happened. And when you think about it, probably, and it's been said before, probably no, maybe not, I don't know, but close to no human event has been as documented as well as the Holocaust. What they're in essence saying is that, I use this when I'm talking to the group, so I'll just pull that in anyway. Think of it this way. The millions of Allied soldiers, Russian, British, US, France, etc., who served in the European theater during World War II, and either liberated the camps, saw evidence of it, came upon the DPs, and so on and so forth. All those millions of people, the millions of pages of archival document in repositories, and I don't know how many countries around the world, as well as the evidence by local people on the ground, of all nationalities, survivors and witnesses, along with the testimony of hundreds of thousands at the least of Germans, of Austrians, etc., Nazis. Put all that together in the equivalent of just think of that, what space, what effort. And what they're saying is a small group of Jews manufactured all that, told everybody what to say, swore them all to silence, and except for these 150 dedicated, intrepid individuals who discovered the truth, no one has come out and spilled the story. It's actually, when you think about it, Holocaust denial is one of the most ridiculous things in the history of the world. It's probably, I don't even know what to compare it to. But that's essentially what they're saying. So they're saying that despite the effort that they made to study it, and despite that incredible mass of evidence, of archival, of documentary, of film, human, etc. So why are they saying that? Either they're totally delusional, which is, by the way, I think going on with some of them at least, or there's an underlying rationale. And to my mind, the underlying rationale is a little bit of what I suggested earlier with Iran. The Holocaust has become a symbol for perhaps ultimate evil in our society. It also laid the groundwork for many things. The war crimes tribunals, human rights on certain levels, international organizations, all these things that are anathema to some people. And beyond that, if your ultimate goal is to restore society to a world where people are judged not on who they are, or what they've done, or what they've accomplished, but on how they were born, the color of their skin, their race, their religion, their gender. If you want to just use those typologies, well, you can't anymore because of the Holocaust. People will basically say, that path leads to Auschwitz. So if you want to get back to that, you have to deal with Auschwitz. And I think that's the fundamental issue. They want to restore that world, and they can't. They can't succeed. They don't have a dream of succeeding unless they negate Auschwitz. And I think that's where they're coming from. So I think it's absolutely part and parcel. It's the same thing. And that's leaving aside all the empirical links between neo-Nazis and Holocaust denial and professional anti-Semites and so on and so forth, of which, to give Mark Weber, we found linked to a German neo-Nazi group. Willis Cardo has been a long time an American financier of the neo-Nazi movement, and so on and so forth. I mean, give you a whole list of those.
So one follow-up to that, and then back to the floor. You mentioned that a motivation, really a political motivation of Iran to support Holocaust denial is this delegitimization of the UN and human rights law.
That's my hypothesis. One of my hypotheses.
Right. Do you have evidence for that, or you're just...
No, it's purely subjective, in a sense. I was looking at it, and I was trying to answer the question, why would Ahmadinejad, who is, my understanding of him and looking and reading about him is that he enjoys the spotlight, he enjoys listening. But, okay, so there's a little bit of that. But this is a policy. In other words, it's not just Ahmadinejad. One of the things I was trying to show was that it existed before him. It's wider than he is. If he was not the president of Iran, there's no guarantee the policy would change in that regard. So I was trying to think of a strategic reason why they would embrace this. they don't need it to delegitimize Israel, which could be another reason. But Iran does not have borders with Israel. It doesn't, it didn't seem that was a necessary tool that they had to go into. So I don't know. I was trying to find a reason, and that's what I came up with. It's hard to find evidence, either way, for that. It's hard to understand why they're so obsessed with it. And if anyone has a better idea, a brilliant idea, or any other ideas, I'd be interested in hearing it. But that's really, the thought that came to me.
Okay, so we had a question in the front and then one in the rear.
And two more questions. First, because you have been talking so much about this important American and European right-wing extremists. What about, for example, Alain Benoit, who is published in the US? Because in Europe, he is well known and works on this issue as an extremist and as an anti-Semite, anti-Zionist, and anti-democratic thinker, and so on. But what do you think? Why is a person like Benoit published in the US for a publisher like Taylor's Press for decades? First question. The second question, you mentioned this very important game on the internet, shooting Hispanic immigrants and so on, and with this little American flag where the stars are replaced by one David star. And this reminds me to some 10 days ago, or 2 weeks ago, there was event at Yale University. The Yale Political Union was inviting Mearsheimer, talking about his infamous book about the Israel army. And unfortunately, I had not the opportunity to speak out at this event, but I do not know if a lot of people in the US know the fact behind this book, because I suppose this book was written not in 2005, as it was published first in the US, but it was published in 1942. And why so? Because in 1942, there was a book published in Nazi Germany from Johann von Leers, one of the most leading ideologists, and this book was called Kräfte hinter Roosevelt. It means those who run America, or those who run Roosevelt. And why I'm mentioning this is because the cover of this book in 1942 was an American flag where all the stars were replaced by David crosses. And the new edition of Mearsheimer's book in Germany, the Israel Lobby, by a campus publisher, has same cover. It means the American flag and all the stars being replaced by David crosses.
Well, there's a lot of, it's a common typology. If you go back, Von Leers, if you talk about, by the way, he was an example of a Nazi who ended up converting to Islam and living in Egypt after the war. He was a classic example of, the reverse route. He was not the only one, but he was an educator, a propagandist who specialized in this stuff. Who Runs America is a long-standing, William Pierce had a thing called Who Runs America, which listed, I forget how many people that were supposedly, the media, etc. Some of them were Jewish. By the way, one of the fascinating things about these guys, in terms of their own research or intellectual capability sometimes, is that they make up their own reality. So you will see Who Runs America, Zionist Jews who control the media. Okay, William Paley used to be on it, the former head of CBS. All right. Rupert Murdoch is on it. There's only one problem. Rupert Murdoch's not Jewish. But it doesn't matter. He's still, you can tell them that over and over again, and Rupert Murdoch will still be on it. So they make up their own reality. I stayed away from Mearsheimer Walt for a specific reason, just because we could spend a whole, a whole other event on them. I don't know if they intentionally took their stuff. I tend to think that there are things that they took. David Duke loved the book and claimed credit for some of it, and claimed some of the citations came from Duke. They denied it. But I think it's that certain stuff of being in the air, being in the atmosphere, where you can't quite put your finger on where you get something, but somehow or other it comes to you. That's in there. What I will say about the book that I found fascinating was Noam Chomsky, who you would imagine would be an extraordinarily strong supporter of the book, wrote, if I can remember the exact phrase, maybe I'll just paraphrase it. Basically, I would like to be able to recommend this book, but I can't because it's such a piece of crap. It was just research so shoddily done that he could not recommend it. And he put that in the public arena. So that kind of, well, you can draw your own conclusions from that. So anyway, so that's what I say about that. The first one, I'm not familiar, I didn't catch the name that you were saying for the first one.
Benoit?
Which
name?
Benoit?
Alain de Benoit? I was mentioning Alain de Benoit, the France thinker who has been published by Petersplatz.
I'm not familiar with that specifically.
Ah, okay.
Okay. So
No problem.
I'll take a pass on that.
Okay. So there was a question in the rear.
Yeah, you started your talk by saying that the religious connections for anti-Semitism were no longer legitimate, that could be drawn on because the church had talked about it.
I want mainstream, yes, I said with exceptions. And the exception, particularly in the Protestant world, is Israel and Zionism. There's a lot of anti-Israel stuff going on in a lot of the private World Council churches and so on. There's a lot of attempted delegitimization of Israel, theological delegitimization of Israel, that really is very close, in my perception, to the line of what would be anti-Semitism and what's not anti-Semitism. And again, it's a major theme that needs to be explored more, but I think it's highly problematic. The Catholic Church is nowhere near that level, although there are manifestations, and Charles Czajkowski was here, is a very, we served, I met him years ago on a Jewish-Polish Catholic dialogue group that was set up by the Archdiocese of New York. So I guess you would not be happy by referencing this, but there's a case in Poland, Radio Maria is virulently anti-Semitic, and the priest in charge of it, Bridget, was actually, even after the controversy erupted, somehow or other managed to get to San Gandolfo, not this past summer, but summer before, but he was greeted by the Pope, and the answer was, of course, that he was innocent, they didn't know, he just happened to be there, but you don't just happen to be in front of a Pope. There's an immense amount of bureaucracy and security that you have to go through. So I don't know if that's a signal. They've reprimanded at the same time. And the Polish churches, certain wings of it definitely are not very happy with Radio Maria and so on. But basically what I was trying to say is the mainstream. In other words, the Vatican II sentiment has officially outlawed this stuff. And I'm not even going to the Mel Gibson wing either. But, so basically that's what I meant, is that the kind of broad mainstream has moved beyond that.
Well, I'm glad you made the clarification. What I was wondering about as well was the religious links with the right wing, because it's not Catholic,
Right.
and it's not even necessarily mainstream Protestant, and also the religious underpinnings of some of the Islamist anti-Semitic sentiment, and how all that fits together in some kind of a package.
I'm not sure it fits together because I still haven't seen much, I have to admit, of extreme Protestant fundamentalism and extreme Islamist fundamentalism sort of coming together. Generally, they're kind of at poles apart, and I don't think we should be particularly shocked by that. I think what you do have, though, are, again, extremely literalist and fundamentalist readings of religious texts. You do not have them mediated through historical experience of working with the other, which I think is and I think it's vital, and that's one of the things that's left out of conversations about religion, is that very often we talk about having voices from the mainstream speak up and take control of religion and so on, and sources that deal with that. Most of the sources, I think, that deal with that come out of the experience of religions having to share space. They're basically practical. They develop a working relationship on how to deal with it. And I mean, I'll be very honest, clearly I'm much more familiar with Jewish tradition than I am with either of the other two. And I've spent more time working with Christians than I have with Muslims. So I'm not claiming total expertise on this. But my experience has been that that's the way these things have developed. And I don't think we pay enough attention to it, nor do I think that we sometimes look at others perceptively. Actually, I'll give you a concrete example. I think the Jewish community, in many cases, has been slow in recognizing that not all Muslims are Arabs, and not all Muslims are directly involved with the Middle East. And it took us, my own organization, last year, created a website called askmusa.org, which is a very, on some level, simple website, but it basically brought basic information about Jews and Judaism to the Muslim world. But it did it in not just English, but in Urdu and Farsi and Arabic and Indonesian. And we've developed relationships. We've done a conference with under the patronage of the former president of Indonesia. And not that everything is wonderful and so, but it means that there's this whole other world that I think Southeast Asia, where Indonesia is the largest Muslim country in the world. Southeast Asia is where more Muslims live than any place else. And they've been left out of the conversation. The conversation had been centered on the Middle East. The conversation had been centered on, radical, on Zionism, on all these hot button issues that did not involve these people directly on a certain level. And I'm glad that they're being brought into the conversation. And it doesn't mean we see eye to eye. It doesn't mean there's not radicalization in that world. But it's still a whole different world that had just been neglected. So I think that's one of the things that we need to do better is just be more perceptive in our outlook.
So we had two questions in the front first.
I'm still thinking back and forth about your hypothesis why Iran, why the Holocaust denial is so strong, and you link this with the UN and human rights, because, well, I found it quite intriguing, the thought, because that would mean this would go back to the roots, so to speak, the UN and the human rights debates. And I just kept wondering whether you could say a little bit more about it, because to me the link was more, clear in terms of Israel and what the Holocaust stands for in a global view, maybe, for the creation of Israel, Israel as a safe place, etc. And I was just wondering, because the UN and the whole human rights debate, they go on, in recent years, they go to very different places, and the UN could be seen, more, in favor of Iran than Israel, and all those things. So,
I think that I looked at it in the sense that the mechanisms, in some ways, that were directly threatening Iran, or Ahmadinejad personally, on a certain levels, were coming out of the UN more than Israel, more directly. The arms control inspectors were from the UN. The whole issue of the nuclear program and so on, from the UN. The Security Council, from the UN. If he's ever brought to trial as a war criminal, or criminal crimes against humanity, and I'm sort of cynical that will ever happen, I'm not sure, whatever. But again, that's from the international bodies. Israel is not directly an actor in those things. In other words, it has an impact, it has a say, and if you want to say that Israel is driving the United States in that conspiracy perspective, fine, say that. But the immediate issue is from that body, or that type of body. And if you're also trying to sway world opinion, the countries, the European countries, or the non-aligned countries, or whatever, they can easily be against Israel, but that doesn't have an impact necessarily on what they're saying about Iranian nuclear capability or so on. This strikes in an indirect fashion, or this strikes at a different target. And I don't know, as I said, it's pure hypothesis, but it just seemed to me that the investment of time and energy was beyond what they needed. Israel was already stigmatized. Israel was already demonized in the Iranian discourse, political, social, etc. They didn't need a conference dealing with the Holocaust. Why these specific subject? Why? They could have done it on anti-Zionism. They had a smaller thing about cartoons in wake of the controversy about the cartoons about Muhammad. They had a smaller international cartoon contest, but they didn't put as much effort into it. They didn't bring so many people in. They didn't broadcast. It seemed disproportionate. So that's what I'm trying to get at. And as I said, it's a hypothesis. I freely admit that. It's hard to find evidence. I could be way off on it. It could be somebody never even thought about it, just decided to do it that way. But I was really trying to give a rationale for, in a sense, what I saw as an irrational act. And a strategic or political or diplomatic rationale in that vein. So it's the best I can do. And if it doesn't fit, it doesn't fit. I really don't know.
So we had another question.
Yeah, actually my question was very similar to the next question.
Okay.
Because I was thinking that this whole Iranian Holocaust denial also stems from, anti-Zionist ideology basically, and sort of does it have a strategic rationale?
No,
I don't know, but
I
it
agree
stems
with
from a
that.
certain ideology, a worldview, a belief system. They believe that the Holocaust.
I agree with that.
happened.
There is a form, and I probably should have said, and that maybe just, I plead that it's so self-evident to me, but I should have put it out there as well, was that, of course, it delegitimizes Israel as well. That goes without saying almost.
Yeah, but also,
but
what
it
I'm
does.
saying do we necessarily have to look for a political, international, strategic rationale? Or is this just, not just, but is this now part of the worldview? That is, if you are anti-Zionist, you deny the Holocaust. Not necessarily, but in most cases. And
Well,
certainly in their case, and that sort of comes from that place. And just for them, it is the logical continuation of their anti-Zionism, anti-Israeli ideologies to deny the Holocaust, which they think Israel uses to justify its
The
existence.
reason
So
that,
their inner logic maybe works.
well, the reason,
I'm not sure that's, just can I jump in for a second? I'm not sure that the anti-Zionism translates to denial of the Holocaust.
It doesn't
well, I was going to
necessarily
say,
translate.
the reason that I'm looking specifically at Iran so deeply is because none of the other Arab or Muslim countries that are even at states of war, Syria, for example, does not have such a committed policy on Holocaust denial. Saudi Arabia, any of these countries, you think about it, they're not so wrapped up in it. Only Iran has, which made me think that there's something specific and special why they're doing it.
The revolutionary society, there's a lot of things there.
But they are unique in that vein, if you think about it.
They're also unique in the area. I don't know either.
I wonder if maybe it goes the other way. The anti-Zionism comes out of the Holocaust denial because it seemed to me that Iran wasn't that vociferously anti-Zionist before. I mean, they talked the game, but they didn't really make a big deal out of it. It seems like it's a way for them to curry favor in the Arab and Muslim world besides the Holocaust denial. So it's sort of like an added benefit.
I mean, it's a possibility. I think that it's really, I think we would just have a lot of conjecture about this because they're not really transparent in terms of their internal, workings. And they haven't really allowed for deep analysis of their stuff. In other words, we don't have access to the equivalent of National Security Council deliberations or policy deliberations or things like that. So I think I'm not going to dismiss anything, basically. I think it's an interesting question, and I think it just needs to be left open to a certain degree.
So I think that's all for today. Thank you again, Mr. Weiss.
Thank you for the questions and for staying. And of course, again, there are elements within all that I mentioned earlier of both religions as well as issues about science and health, in which that form of anti-Semitism still exists today. But nonetheless, it is really in its purest form the strongest, most overt sense of anti-Semitism. In other words, even people and institutions that claim that they're not anti-Semitic often will allow extreme manifestations of anti-Zionism to come out. And obviously the birth of the State of Israel was a further factor that enabled that to flourish. And so basically that kind of anti-Semitism has really jumped out at us. And in recent years has become even stronger. There was also another factor in that. The anti-Semitism of the conspiracy theorists, and the classic text, of course, is the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, was based on the idea that a small core of Jews, a cabal, if you will, with its connotations of Kabbalah, of esoteric mysticism, and so on, and secret Jewish plotting, was located in the fringes of society, or in the shadows of society, pulling strings and manipulating. But with the creation of the State of Israel, Jews were no longer in the closet, so to speak. They had come out as full-fledged actors onto the stage of history, of international politics. And that meant for the anti-Semites, it was a step further that was harder for them to take. And maybe a classic manifestation of this was the last political will of Adolf Hitler. He wrote, "Centuries will pass away, but the hatred against those finally responsible, international jury and its helpers will grow. I have also made it quite plain that if the nations of Europe are again to be regarded as mere shares to be bought and sold by the international conspirators of money and finance, then that race Jewry, which is a real criminal of the murderous struggle, will be saddled with responsibility." So today, the anti-Semitism, which was always a constant, especially on the radical right, was commanded by one of its iconic figures to avenge itself against the perceived Jewish victory at the end of World War II. And following immediately on that, 3 years after that Jewish victory, was the emergence of the Jew into the world stage as a full-fledged actor. And this meant that the imperative to act was perhaps even stronger than it had ever been before. So what we have essentially is a pattern that the historian Robert Chazen once described as, he wrote that every new stage in the evolution of anti-Jewish thinking is marked by a dialectical interplay between a prior legacy of negative stereotypes and the realities of a new social context. Meaning that the stereotypes always existed in certain levels, but they're brought into new shape and given new form by the context of the times in which they appear.
I'd like to invite Mr. Weitzman up, and if you could help me welcome him.
Thank you very much for that welcome, and thank you for everyone for coming out tonight. I want to sort of begin against all rules of all speakers, where you're told never to apologize for anything when you start with. But I actually do want to apologize a little bit, because I realized as we were getting into it that the topic, the theme, the title of the presentation tonight was just extraordinarily broad. And there's no way that I, or I think almost anybody else, could really cover what that implies in that title. And I'm going to kind of narrow it down a little bit. So instead of this whole broad anti-Semitism, there's so many different, I think, varieties of anti-Semitism today that I'm really going to focus on one or two specific areas and try to kind of wrap that up and spend a little time with them. So if I had to pick a title, I would actually change it a little bit to something called The Magical Logic. And I'm working off a quote by the historian Saul Friedlander, who wrote, "The magical logic of the marriage of the opposites, the coincidence of themes from the radical right and radical left, that is the most fundamental feature of fascism." And in some ways, the new discourse that I want to talk about and explore a little bit are that merging of themes, the borrowing from extreme right into left and so on, that go into and often play off of globalization and some of the other issues that are coursing through the world today, and sort of look at it in a very specific manner. If we think about it, when I mentioned before about anti-Semitism being, so many varieties of anti-Semitism, it used to be before the Shoah, before the Holocaust, we really sort of only talked about three different varieties. There was religious anti-Semitism, the classical anti-Semitism that had grown up in the religious tradition of Christianity and so on, and I'm not going to get into that. And I know my friend Charles here has also been interested in that topic for a long time. But basically, the results of the Holocaust led into Vatican II, the actions in the mainstream churches, which essentially repudiated all forms of theological anti-Semitism. That's not to say that strains don't exist today. It's not to say that there are not issues today. It's not to say that there are certainly major controversies, and I'll get to some of them right now. But in essence, the theological anti-Semitism that had existed and had in many ways contributed, not the only factor, but contributed to the Holocaust, was delegitimized. And of course, the same thing goes with what used to be called racial science. That as well was delegitimized. Eugenics and so on. Except for certain scientists still operating today, but on the core, on the edge of fringes of mainstream science, that is no longer acceptable either. So what was left was really one form of anti-Semitism that still has managed to maintain its viral capability. And that was sort of the conspiratorial, political form of anti-Semitism, and it obviously blossomed further into anti-Zionism. The members of this movement to New Orleans, and he created something called the New Orleans Protocol, which basically was a document meant to end infighting among the groups, the figures in this movement, and to establish sort of ground rules to get along with. And of course, by calling them together, bringing them together, and being the first one to sign the document, he was not only reasserting his presence in the movement, but his prime role, his leadership role in a sense, of bringing the person to get everybody together. But during that meeting, Duke, of course, singled out Jews as signs of the world problems. And what he said, and specifically about Jews, was the worldwide Jewish conspiracy to destroy the white race through immigration and miscegenation, race mixing. The fear of race mixing is one of the prime fears that motivate these people. What's interesting about it is that it's not just considered on racial terms, but it's considered part and parcel of the Jewish plot. If you have time, I was going to show you some internet websites, but I'm just going to describe a game that's present on the internet now called Border Patrol. This is a game that, very simple. It shows immigrants crossing a river, and obviously they're Hispanic, Latino immigrants. The river Cactus, obviously meant to refer to the Rio Grande in Texas. And the idea is that these are illegal immigrants crossing the border from Mexico into the United States. The object of the game is quite simple. You shoot as many as you can. The more you shoot, kill, the higher your score. And in the corner is a small American flag. But in the corner of the American flag where the stars are, instead of the stars that you usually see in the American flag, is one star, the Star of David. Meant to show, and this game operates on many levels, meant to show that while the U.S. is being weakened by these illegal immigrants, the person or the group letting them in, causing the United States to let them in, pulling the strings once again in control of the U.S. government, are the Jews. And the acronym very often used by these people is ZOG, Zionist Occupied Government, referring to the United States government. Or a variant, JOG, Jewish Occupied Government. Which is one of the ways that, by the way, that they can also claim that U.S. laws don't apply to them, and U.S. government rules don't apply to them because the government's been occupied, taken over. It's not a true American government anymore. So this whole thing operates on different levels. Now that game is sinister enough on a certain level. What I observed last winter was that the game had been around for a couple of years, about 3-4 years. And then I noticed last year on the internet, I found mention of it not longer on the extremist websites, but I found mention of it in mainstream gaming sites. where there were discussions of it and its qualities and so on. Not its theme, but just its qualities. And I saw this kind of leaching of the extremist fringe, in certain cases, into the mainstream, which is exactly what they desire and what they want. The whole internet thing is worth a whole nother presentation. I don't know if we'll have time for it. If we do, I can show you a lot on it, but we'll see if we can get to it today. Duke refers to his own awakening to the Jewish issue. He calls it Jewish supremacism. So what I want to do here is explore some of that context a little bit more. Now, and I'm going to do it by basically looking at some of the figures and some of the themes that come out, have been used recently in the extremist right wing, if you want to call it neo-Nazi, whatever you want to call it, and I'm not going to get into strict definitions of all those terms, but to explore those a little bit, and then show how they began to permeate out of their narrow context into a wider context and some of the influences that they may have. So for example, in the United States right now, they're going through a period of flux in the extreme right wing. Former charismatic and leadership figures like William Pierce of the National Alliance, Richard Butler of the Aryan Nations, Matt Hale of the World Church of the Creator, have all left the scene. Pierce and Butler died. Hale was in prison. Each of those three, and I'll pick those three specifically, were noteworthy. One is because they had reached a certain level of notoriety or prominence in the movement. Two is because they were each trained beyond what we sometimes think and look as a stereotype of an extreme right-winger. And sometimes many people still have the idea that these are people who, are obviously failures in the world and are embittered because they're reduced to pumping gas and can't compete in the world today. Or they're on unemployment or whatever. We look at them as total failures. But each of those three that I mentioned were not failures in the classic sense. Pierce had a PhD in physics from Rice and taught at Oregon State before he devoted his time, starting in the mid-1960s, being a full-time neo-Nazi. Butler was an aeronautical engineer for Lockheed and held certain patents, including one for the tires, I think, that are still used on airplanes. And Hale, who was much younger, in his 30s, and finally sentenced to life imprisonment for trying to kill a federal judge, was a law school graduate and a classical musician who played in an orchestra he lived in Peoria, but in that area. So each of those three had the ability to succeed and turn that ability not to conventional success, but to organizing and to their work in the neo-Nazi movement. But they're all gone now. They're off the scene. What's left are really second-raters, and that's being kind. But each of them has made their mark. The person who fills that gap the most today is a person that you've probably heard of, named David Duke. Not going into Duke's whole background and his whole history, but Duke has a group called Euro, which is the European American Unity and Rights Organization, and has recently tried to reinvent himself as a thinker, as a leader. He received a PhD from a Ukrainian university, a private university, a few years ago for a dissertation that was an anti-Semitic tract. This university has been denounced by the Ukrainian president, the Ukrainian Academy of Arts and Sciences, but is essentially specialized in anti-Semitism. It's a management school, and Duke's now a part-time faculty member there. But after he got out of prison, another story. He was in there for basically defrauding his followers and so on, and tax issues. In 2004, he called together
the first event for YIISA of the 2008 to 2009 academic year. I'd like to welcome everyone on behalf of YIISA and on behalf of myself and also Charles Small. I'm Lauren Clark, the coordinator for YIISA, and I am going to apologize for Charles, who cannot be here this evening. He is actually attending a conference in Washington, D.C. On the state-sanctioned incitement to genocide, which YIISA is co-sponsoring with the International Association of Genocide Scholars. So the conference will address Iranian President Ahmadinejad's visit to the UN General Assembly in New York yesterday, and also specifically his repeated calls for wiping Israel off the map. So he sends his apologies and hopes to see all of you soon at our other events. So at this time, I'd like to welcome Mr. Mark Weitzman. Mark Weitzman is the director of the Task Force Against Hate and Terrorism at the Simon Wiesenthal Center. He is also the Associate Director of Education there. He is a Chief Representative of the Center of the United Nations in New York, and he's currently a member of the Advisory Board for ISGAP, the Institute for Social and Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. He's a member of the U.S. delegation to the Task Force for International Cooperation on Holocaust Education, Remembrance, and Research. He's a board member and former vice president of the Association of Holocaust Organizations, also on the advisory panel of experts on freedom of religion or belief of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, also known as the OSCE. And he's also a member of the Jewish Catholic Dialogue Group of New York. Previously, Mr. Weitzman was the founding director of the Simon Wiesenthal Center's New York Tolerance Center. He is a prominent lecturer, speaker, and panelist for multiple conferences and groups, including Congress, the UN, the European Union, U.S. Army, and the FBI. In April of 2008, he was one of the Jewish leaders invited to meet with Pope Benedict XVI during his visit to the U.S., and was also selected by the Pew Charitable Trust as one of the 25 participants in a conference on international religious freedom. He has an extensive list of publications, including being the co-editor and also contributing to the memorial volume in honor of Simon Wiesenthal entitled Anti-Semitism, the Generic Hatred, Essays in Memory of Simon Wiesenthal, which was published in 2007 and also received the 2007 National Jewish Book Award for the Best Anthology. A forthcoming publication by Mr. Weitzman will be coming out this fall and published by the Vidal Sassoon Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and it is a monograph entitled Globalization, Conspiracy Theory, and the Shoah. So